The Treaty of Versailles sealed the end of the First World War. The document was signed in the famous French shadow outside of Paris. The spirit was more of revenge of World War II.
On November 11th, 1918, the world finally stopped screaming. The Great War was over, and everyone desperately wanted to believe that the horror was behind them. But in a quiet railway carriage in France, the peace being signed wasn't a handshake, it was a delayed fuse. While people danced in the streets of London and Paris, they were actually just standing in the middle of a 20-year intermission. The world hadn't found a cure for war. It had just hit the snooze button. Did people see the Second World War coming? Let's begin. The architecture of resentment, 1919 to 1924. When the ink dried on the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, the Allied leaders patted themselves on the back for a job well done. In reality, they had just written the most expensive revenge note in history. To understand why World War II happened, you have to stop looking at 1939 and start looking at the faces of the German soldiers walking home in 1919. They hadn't been invaded. Their army hadn't collapsed on the battlefield. Yet they were told they had lost, and more importantly, that everything, every death, every bullet, every ruined city, was entirely their fault. This was the war guilt clause, and it was the ultimate psychological gut punch. It didn't just hurt Germany's pride, it liquidated its future. The Allies slapped a price tag on the war that was so high, it was practically a joke. 132 billion gold marks. Germany was essentially being asked to pay for a party they were told they started, despite everyone in Europe having spent the last decade playing with matches. The map of Europe was sliced up like a birthday cake at a party where Germany wasn't invited. They lost 13% of their land and 6 million of their people. Huge chunks of territory were handed over to create a new Poland, and the Polish corridor effectively cut Germany in half. Imagine if a foreign power told the United States they were giving a strip of land through the middle of the country to someone else, and DC was suddenly disconnected from New York. It was a logistical nightmare and a national embarrassment. Then came the stab-in-the-back myth, the Dolchstoßlegende. Because the German public hadn't seen their borders crossed by Allied troops, they couldn't wrap their heads around the surrender. Right-wing agitators and disgruntled generals started whispering a toxic narrative. The army didn't lose. The politicians, the socialists, and the Jewish community sold us out at home. It was a lie, but it was a comfortable lie. It gave a broken people someone to blame. While the politicians argued, the economy decided to take a swan dive.
Germany is meticulously preparing the case that she's not solely guilty of starting the war.
By 1923, the German mark wasn't even worth the paper it was printed on. We're talking about hyperinflation so absurd that people were literally using stacks of cash as building blocks for their kids, or burning bags of money because it was cheaper than buying firewood. If you went into a cafe for a coffee, the price might double by the time you finished your cup. The middle class, the backbone of any stable country, saw their life savings vanish in a weekend. When you take away a person's ability to feed their family, they stop caring about things like democracy or parliamentary procedure. They start looking for a guy with a loud voice and a simple solution. During this chaos, the French and Belgians decided to occupy the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, because the reparations payments were late. This was like a debt collector moving into your kitchen because you missed a credit card payment. It sparked passive resistance, more strikes, and even more hatred. The German people felt like they were being strangled while the rest of the world watched. The League of Nations was supposed to be the referee in this mess, but it was born with its hands tied. The US never joined, and the League had no army to back up its strongly worded letters. It was a debating club in a room full of people starting to reach for their guns. By the mid-20s, things actually started to look up for a second. The golden years of the Weimar Republic. The currency stabilized, the jazz clubs were hopping, and it looked like maybe, just maybe, the world would move on. But the foundation was made of sand. The German economy was propped up by American loans. It was a house of cards waiting for a breeze. When the 20s ended, that breeze turned into a hurricane. The architecture of resentment wasn't just about money or borders. It was about a feeling that the system was rigged, that the peace was a lie, and that the only way to get respect was to take it back by force. The stage was set. All that was missing was a catalyst to turn that resentment into an explosion. The strongman's playbook. If 1923 was a bad headache, 1929 was a full-blown heart attack. Just as Germany was starting to find its feet, the US stock market took a giant leap off a skyscraper. And because the world's economy was basically a giant game of Jenga, everything came crashing down. The American loans that were keeping Germany afloat vanished overnight. By 1932, 6 million Germans were standing on street corners with nothing to do but be angry and hungry. When people are that desperate, they don't want a nuanced debate about fiscal policy.
And it sowed the seeds of growing resentment in Germany, while the Allies, Britain, France, equally still felt very much aggrieved.
They want a savior. Enter the strongman. The playbook for the modern dictator wasn't actually written in Berlin. It was written in Rome. Benito Mussolini, a man who looked like he was carved out of granite and spoke with enough theatricality to fill an opera house, had already shown the world how it was done. In 1922, his black shirts marched on Rome, and the King of Italy, terrified of a civil war, basically handed him the keys to the country. Mussolini promised order. He promised that the trains would run on time. He promised to turn Italy back into the Roman Empire. He called himself Duce, and he made fascism look, well, efficient. In Germany, a failing artist turned political firebrand named Adolf Hitler was taking notes. He realized that you didn't need to overthrow the government with a violent coup if you could just convince the public to vote the government out of existence. He took Mussolini's blueprint and added a much darker, much more specific ingredient: a scapegoat. The Nazi Party's rise wasn't an overnight fluke. It was a slow-motion car crash. In the 1928 elections, they were a joke, pulling in barely 2% of the vote. But as the breadlines grew longer in the early 30s, the Nazi rhetoric started to sound less like crazy talk and more like a plan. Hitler was a master of the new media of his time. He used planes to fly from city to city. He used radio to blast his voice into every living room, and he used massive, choreographed rallies to make his movement look inevitable. He didn't just win an election, he created a cult of personality. By 1933, the traditional conservative politicians in Germany thought they could tame him.
The document was signed in the famous French shadow outside of Paris. The spirit was more of revenge of World War II and all the atrocities that happened because of that.
They figured they'd make him chancellor, put a few sensible guys in his cabinet, and use his popularity to their advantage. They were wrong. Hitler didn't want a seat at the table. He wanted to burn the table and build a new one. Within months, the Reichstag, the parliament building, went up in flames. Civil liberties were suspended, and the Enabling Act gave Hitler total power. The referee had just joined the team he was supposed to be officiating. But it wasn't just Germany and Italy. The strongman vibe was catching. In Japan, the civilian government was losing its grip to a military elite who believed that Japan's destiny lay in conquering Asia. They were looking at a world where the great powers had all the resources, and they decided they wanted a piece of the action. In 1931, the Japanese military essentially staged a fake bombing, the Mukden incident, as an excuse to invade Manchuria. When the League of Nations said, "Hey, you can't do that," Japan simply walked out of the room. The message was clear. If you were strong enough, the rules didn't apply to you. This period was the death of the liberal world order. People were tired of the messiness of democracy, which seemed to lead only to poverty and bickering. They looked at the guys in the sharp uniforms with the catchy slogans and the promise of national glory, and they thought, why not?
Versailles is one of the most controversial agreements in history. Its cracks left open the possibility of a second global conflict.
What the world didn't realize was that the strongman's playbook only has one ending. These regimes weren't built for peace. They were built for expansion. Their economies were geared toward rearmament, producing tanks and planes instead of butter and clothes. You can't build a society entirely on the promise of restoring greatness without eventually having to go out and prove it on a battlefield. By the mid-1930s, the dictators weren't just talking anymore. They were looking at their watches. They knew the democracies were tired, distracted, and broke. The pieces were in place, the leaders were in power, and the world was about to find out exactly what happens when you let the bullies run the playground. With the strongmen firmly in the driver's seat, The international community had to decide if they were going to be the brakes or just the passengers. The failure of the referees. While the dictators were busy sharpening their swords, the rest of the world was desperately trying to pretend that if they just stayed quiet enough, the monsters under the bed would go away. This was the era of the referees, the League of Nations, and the leaders of Britain and France, and their performance was, to put it mildly, a disaster. They weren't just dropping the ball, they were handing it to the other team and apologizing for the inconvenience. The League of Nations was supposed to be the world's police force. Instead, it turned out to be more like a HOA with no actual power to fine anyone. In 1935, Mussolini decided he wanted to relive the glory days of the Roman Empire, so he invaded Ethiopia. The Ethiopian emperor, Haile Selassie, literally went to the League and begged for help, warning them, "It is us today, it will be you tomorrow." The League responded with some half-hearted economic sanctions that didn't even include oil, the one thing Mussolini actually needed to run his tanks. Italy ignored them, won the war, and the League's credibility officially hit zero. Seeing that the referees were effectively blind, Hitler decided to see how far he could push his luck. In 1936, he marched his troops into the Rhineland, a zone that was supposed to be permanently demilitarized, to keep France safe. This was a massive gamble. Hitler's own generals were sweating. They had orders to retreat if the French showed even a hint of resistance. But the French didn't move. They were traumatized by the memory of the trenches and wouldn't act without the British. The British, meanwhile, felt that Germany was only walking into their own backyard. Hitler had bluffed, and the world had folded. Then came the Spanish Civil War. It was a brutal, bloody mess that served as a live-fire exercise for the upcoming World War. While the democracies stayed neutral, Hitler and Mussolini sent planes, tanks, and volunteers to help the fascist General Franco.
Civilization that's ever been encountered, and this was because the Third Reich set out.
They used Spanish cities like Guernica as a laboratory to see what happened when you dropped thermite and high explosives on civilian populations from the air. The lesson? Air power was the future, and the fascists were getting really good at it. But the king of all refereeing failures was Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister. Chamberlain wasn't a villain. He was a man who had seen the horrors of 1914 and was willing to do almost anything to prevent a repeat. This policy was called appeasement. The logic was simple. Hitler has legitimate gripes. If we just give him what he wants, within reason, he'll settle down and become a normal neighbor. It reached a boiling point in 1938 over the Sudetenland, a piece of Czechoslovakia with a lot of German speakers. Hitler demanded it. The Czechs, who had a modern army and solid defenses, were ready to fight, but they needed their allies. Instead, Britain and France met Hitler in Munich, without the Czechs in the room, and basically gave him the territory on a silver platter. Chamberlain flew home, waved a piece of paper, and famously declared he had secured peace for our time. Hitler, meanwhile, reportedly called the Allied leaders little worms. He didn't want the Sudetenland, he wanted the world, and he now knew that the people supposed to stop him were terrified of him. Appeasement didn't prevent the war. It just ensured that when the war finally started, Germany would be much stronger, and the democracies would look much weaker. The referees had spent a decade trying to buy peace with other people's land and other people's freedom. By 1939, they were out of currency, out of time, and out of excuses. The intermission was over, and the lights were starting to dim for the final act. By the time the world realized that you can't satisfy a shark by feeding it your friends, the shark was already heading for the main course. The point of no return. By 1939, the air in Europe didn't just feel heavy. It felt like a room filled with gas waiting for a single spark. Hitler had already swallowed Czechoslovakia whole, breaking every promise he'd made at Munich.
Germany, while the Allies, Britain, France, equally still felt very much aggrieved.
The little worms had finally grown a spine, with Britain and France drawing a literal line in the sand. If you touch Poland, it's war. But Hitler had one more card to play, and it was a card that absolutely no one saw coming. For years, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had been screaming at each other like blood rivals. Hitler hated communism. Stalin hated fascism. They were the two biggest predators in the jungle, and everyone assumed they would eventually tear each other apart. But in August 1939, the world woke up to a headline that felt like a glitch in the Matrix: the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The two dictators had signed a non-aggression treaty. On the surface, they promised not to fight each other. Under the table, they had pulled out a map of Poland and a ruler, literally drawing a line down the middle to decide who got what. It was the ultimate devil's deal. Hitler got a green light to invade Poland without worrying about a war on two fronts, and Stalin got a buffer zone and some breathing room. The last safety rail on the cliff of global peace had just snapped. On September 1st, 1939, at 4:45 a.m., the fuse finally hit the powder keg. German panzers crossed the Polish border, and the world saw a new kind of horror: blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This wasn't the slow, muddy grind of the First World War. This was speed, radio coordination, and terrifying dive bombers, the Stukas, screaming down from the sky. Poland fought back with everything they had, but they were caught in a nightmare. While they were trying to hold back the German tide from the west, the Red Army smashed into them from the east 2 weeks later. The intermission wasn't just over. The theatre was on fire. On September 3rd, Neville Chamberlain, the man who had tried so hard to be the peacemaker, sat in front of a BBC microphone with a heavy heart. His voice lacked the fire of a warrior. It sounded like the voice of a man who had realized his best wasn't enough. He announced that Great Britain was at war with Germany. So what really started World War II? It wasn't just one guy or one bad treaty. It was a perfect storm of failures. It was a peace treaty in 1919 that sought revenge rather than stability.
Germany became a republic on the 9th of November 1918, the day Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated, and 2 days before the armistice.
It was an economic collapse that made people trade their sanity for a loaf of bread. It was the cowardice of an international community that watched bullies take what they wanted and did nothing but write letters. And ultimately, it was the calculation of dictators who realized that the rest of the world was too afraid of war to actually stop one. The tragedy of 1918 to 1939 is that the Second World War wasn't an accident. It was an avoidable catastrophe that was built brick by brick over 20 years of resentment, ego, and silence. The world had spent 2 decades trying to avoid a fight, only to end up in the biggest one in human history. The war to end all wars had failed. The real one was just beginning. The Second World War wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow-motion demolition. Between 1918 and 1939, the world didn't lack for warnings. It lacked for will. We see a tragic arc where the heavy-handedness of the Treaty of Versailles created a vacuum. The Great Depression filled that vacuum with desperation, and the appeasement policy gave that desperation a free pass to arm itself to the teeth. The war started because the global referees tried to play by a set of rules that the players had already burned. It's a chilling reminder that peace isn't just the absence of fighting, it's the active maintenance of justice and stability. By the time the first shots rang out in Poland, the long fuse had already burned through 20 years of missed opportunities. The world finally woke up, but only after the house was already coming down. The lights went out in the 20th century, and the world was left in the dark. Hit that subscribe button to make sure you're here when we upload more in this very channel. Thank you for supporting us.